The story of the Macchi C.202 Folgore begins with the struggles of the Italian aircraft industry in the late 1930s. By the outbreak of the Second World War, Italy possessed an air force, the Regia Aeronautica, that was still largely equipped with biplanes or underpowered monoplanes that lagged behind contemporary designs from Britain, Germany, and the United States. The Fiat CR-42 biplane and the Macchi C.200 Saetta represented the backbone of Italian fighter units at the time, and while the C.200 had modern features such as an all-metal monoplane structure and retractable landing gear, it lacked the speed, firepower, and climb rate of frontline Allied and German fighters. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, the inadequacy of its fighter aircraft became painfully clear in clashes over Malta, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. The pressing need for a modern, high-performance fighter drove Italian designers to search for new power plants that could transform their existing airframes into competitive machines. Chief among them was Mario Castoldi, a seasoned engineer at Macchi Aeronautica, who had designed several successful racing seaplanes in the 1920s. His work on the Macchi MC-72, which set world speed records, reflected his emphasis on aerodynamic refinement and powerful engines. Castoldi had already produced the Macchi C.200, but its radial Fiat A74 engine delivered only about 840 horsepower, limiting its top speed to just over 500 km/h, insufficient against British Hurricanes or Spitfires. The breakthrough came through cooperation with Germany. In 1940, Italy acquired licenses to produce the Daimler-Benz DB601A, a liquid-cooled inverted V12 engine used in the Messerschmitt Bf 109E. Producing 1,175 horsepower, the DB601 offered far superior performance compared to Italy's domestic engines. Castoldi seized the opportunity to redesign the C.200 around this new power plant, creating what would become the Macchi C.202 Folgore, Thunderbolt. The Folgore represented more than just an engine upgrade. Castoldi reworked the airframe to reduce drag and improve aerodynamics, reshaping the fuselage and nose to house the streamlined inline engine and radiator system. The result was a sleek, elegant design with lines reminiscent of the Bf 109 but retaining Italian characteristics. The airframe used all-metal stressed skin construction, and its wing design, inherited from the C.200, provided excellent maneuverability while maintaining stability at higher speeds. From the beginning, the Folgore was conceived as a leap forward in Italian fighter design, bringing the Regia Aeronautica into line with contemporary standards. For the first time, Italian pilots would have an aircraft capable of matching Allied fighters in speed, agility, and climb. The significance of this transformation was immense. The Folgore promised to restore the credibility of Italy's air arm, which had been tarnished by outdated machines in the early months of the war. The challenges of development, however, were considerable. Italy's industrial base was strained, and producing the DB601 under license as the Alfa Romeo RA1000 RC41 Monzon required new facilities, tooling, and technical expertise. Delays and shortages threatened the project's timeline. Nonetheless, by 1941, the prototype was ready for flight tests, setting the stage for one of the most important aircraft in Italy's wartime arsenal. Thus, the origins of the Macchi C.202 lay at the intersection of necessity, opportunity, and technical brilliance. It was born from Italy's recognition of its shortcomings, Castoldi's skill in aerodynamics, and the availability of advanced German engine technology. The Folgore would soon demonstrate that Italy could produce a frontline fighter worthy of its adversaries, and capable of earning the respect of both friend and foe alike. The prototype of the Macchi C.202 took shape in the early months of 1940, when Castoldi and his design team completed the modifications to adapt the Saetta airframe to the new Daimler-Benz DB601A engine. The first prototype, essentially a modified C.200 fitted with the German inline engine, took to the skies in August 1940 at Lonate Pozzolo Airfield. Test pilot Guido Carestiato reported immediately noticeable improvements in performance. Where the C.200 struggled to keep pace with British Hurricanes, the new design exhibited remarkable speed and climb, with a top speed exceeding 600 km/h in level flight, an extraordinary improvement over its predecessor. The early test flights confirmed the validity of Castoldi's approach. The inline engine reduced drag considerably, and the sleek fuselage provided a refined aerodynamic profile. Maneuverability remained excellent, as the wing structure from the C-200 had already been well regarded for its agility. However, the prototype revealed several areas needing further refinement. Engine cooling proved problematic in the hot Mediterranean climate, requiring adjustments to the radiator design. Stability at high speeds also demanded modifications to the tail surfaces. These issues, though significant, were not insurmountable, and development proceeded rapidly under wartime urgency. The prototype, designated C.202 Series 0, was soon joined by additional pre-production models, allowing for expanded evaluation by both factory pilots and Regia Aeronautica personnel. The results consistently demonstrated that the aircraft represented a breakthrough for Italian fighter aviation. During comparative trials against the German Bf-109E, the Folgore showed slightly inferior climb performance but excellent turning ability and competitive top speed. Italian officers recognized at once that this was the fighter Italy had been lacking since the beginning of the war. The transition from prototype to production, however, was complicated by Italy's strained industrial situation. The license-built DB601A, produced domestically as the Alfa Romeo R81000 RC41i Monzon, required advanced metallurgy and precision manufacturing techniques that stretched Italian industry to its limits. Shortages of high-quality alloys combined with bombing disruptions and logistical bottlenecks slowed output of the new power plant. For this reason, the first batches of C-202s were built in small numbers, allocated carefully to frontline units for operational evaluation. Despite these challenges, the aircraft performed well enough in trials to earn high praise from Italian and German observers alike. Luftwaffe officers who inspected the Folgore regarded it as one of the few Axis aircraft capable of competing on even terms with the latest Allied fighters. Italian pilots, long accustomed to flying underpowered machines, were struck by the speed and responsiveness of the new aircraft, though some noted that its armament, typically two 12.7-meter Breda Safat machine guns mounted in the nose, was relatively light compared to Allied standards. By late 1941, the C-202 had passed the crucial stage of proving its reliability and combat readiness. The Folgore's successful testing phase not only confirmed its technical viability, but also reinvigorated the morale of the Regia Aeronautica, which now anticipated the deployment of an aircraft that could restore balance to the increasingly challenging air war. The stage was set for its introduction into service, where the Folgore would begin to demonstrate its true value in combat operations over North Africa and the Mediterranean. The Macchi C.202 Folgore began entering frontline service in late 1941, with the first squadrons receiving the aircraft being those deployed to the North African theater. The initial operational conversion took place with the Verdegreen Stormo and Vordegreen Stormo, units that had previously flown the C-200 Saetta and were eager to transition to the much more capable Folgore. Early reports from pilots confirmed what the test flights had already suggested. The new fighter was fast, agile, and finally able to stand on equal terms with Allied opponents. The aircraft's combat debut occurred in the skies over Libya in November 1941 during the battles around Tobruk. Here, the C-202 immediately distinguished itself against British Hurricanes and even the formidable Spitfire 5. Italian pilots found that, although the Spitfire retained a slight edge in climb and acceleration, the Folgore was more maneuverable in sustained turns and had a higher diving speed thanks to its clean aerodynamics. Against the Hurricane, the Italian fighter enjoyed clear superiority in speed, climb, and agility, allowing pilots to dictate the terms of engagement. Reactions from Italian airmen were overwhelmingly positive. For the first time since Italy's entry into the war, they had a machine that could compete credibly with the best Allied fighters. The Folgore's cockpit layout, though cramped, offered good visibility, and its handling qualities inspired confidence. Its principal drawback remained its armament: two 12.7mm Breda Safat machine guns, supplemented in some versions by two 7.7mm wing-mounted guns. Against heavily built Allied aircraft like the Curtiss P-40 and later the Spitfire, this firepower was often insufficient to ensure quick kills, requiring longer bursts and more precise marksmanship. Still, pilots praised its accuracy and stability during firing runs, which compensated to some extent for the limited hitting power. Operational trials in North Africa quickly demonstrated the Folgore's adaptability. It was employed both as a pure interceptor against Allied bombers and escorts and in limited ground attack roles when required. Escort missions for Axis convoys across the Mediterranean also became a regular duty, where the C.202's speed proved invaluable in countering RAF attacks launched from Malta. In these roles, the fighter began to build a reputation among Axis forces as Italy's first truly modern combat aircraft of the war. Allied intelligence also took note of the new machine. Reports from RAF pilots described an unfamiliar Italian fighter with excellent speed and maneuverability, noting that it represented a significant improvement over the previously encountered C-200. The British quickly realized that engaging the Folgore required respect, and that underestimating it could prove fatal. As a result, tactical instructions were updated to avoid turning engagements with the C-202, and to rely instead on superior firepower and coordinated tactics. Back in Italy, as more units began to convert to the Folgore, it was deployed in increasing numbers across the Mediterranean and later over the Italian mainland. Its early operational role was marked by a mixture of successes and the challenges of limited availability. Production constraints meant that only a handful of squadrons could be fully equipped at any one time, forcing the Regia Aeronautica to mix C-202s with older fighters within the same units. Despite this, the Folgore quickly became the preferred mount of Italy's elite pilots, including several aces, who used it to score victories against Allied aircraft. By the end of its first year in service, the Macchi C.202 had proven itself as the finest Italian fighter yet fielded. It restored confidence within the Regia Aeronautica and earned grudging respect from the Allies. Its operational debut not only validated the design but also signaled that Italy could produce aircraft capable of competing in the demanding aerial environment of the Second World War. The Folgore had moved beyond the testing stage into active combat, where it began to establish its reputation as Italy's best fighter of the war. The combat record of the Macchi C.202 Folgore unfolded across multiple fronts, with its most significant employment in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and later in the defense of Italy itself. From late 1941 to 1943, the Folgore became the mainstay of Italy's fighter force, taking on Allied aircraft ranging from Hurricanes and P-40s to the increasingly common Spitfires and bombers of the U.S. Army Air Forces. In the Desert War, the Folgore quickly earned a reputation as a formidable adversary. Its speed, climb, and agility allowed Italian pilots to fight on nearly equal terms with RAF Spitfire Phi squadrons and gave them a decisive edge over the older Hurricanes and P-40 Tomahawks. Tactically, Italian commanders began to pair C-202 units with German Bf-109s, creating mixed formations that combined the strengths of both aircraft. Folgore pilots often engaged Allied fighters while the Messerschmitts focused on protecting bombers or breaking up enemy formations. This cooperation made Axis air units more effective in countering the growing Allied air presence over Libya and Egypt. The Folgore was also used extensively in bomber escort missions. Italian and German bombers operating against Allied positions, supply convoys, and airfields required protection, and the C-202 proved highly capable in this role. On long-range escort flights to Malta, for example, the Folgore's speed allowed it to intercept British fighters before they could reach Axis bombers. In these missions, Italian pilots claimed numerous victories, though losses mounted as the Allies introduced newer Spitfire variants. Over Malta, the Folgore faced some of its toughest challenges. The island's defenders, equipped with modern Spitfires supplied by Britain, were skilled and determined. While the C-202 could match the Spitfire Phi in many respects, the heavier armament of the British fighter gave it an advantage in terms of firepower. Italian pilots had to rely on superior maneuvering and teamwork to offset this imbalance. Combat over the island became a testing ground for Italian tactics and highlighted the Folgore's strengths and weaknesses under sustained, high-intensity operations. As the war expanded, the Folgore encountered new Allied opponents. With the arrival of American forces in North Africa, the C-202 faced the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk in large numbers, as well as the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning and eventually the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Against the P-40, the Folgore retained an edge in agility and climb rate, allowing Italian pilots to outmaneuver their opponents in dogfights. Against the P-38, results were more mixed. The Folgore could outturn the American twin-engine fighter, but was disadvantaged in speed and firepower. By 1943, as P-47s began to appear, the performance gap widened further, with the American aircraft proving faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than the Italian fighter. The defense of Sicily and mainland Italy in 1943 brought the Folgore into direct confrontation with large-scale Allied bombing campaigns. C.202 units scrambled to intercept formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, often under escort by P-38s, P-47s, and Spitfires. Against heavy bombers, the Folgore's light armament of two 12.7mm machine guns was inadequate. Even when pilots managed to penetrate escort screens and fire on bombers, the lack of cannons meant that damaging or downing four-engine aircraft was extremely difficult. Many Folgores were lost in these desperate defensive battles, highlighting the aircraft's limitations in firepower. Despite these challenges, the Folgore's combat record was impressive relative to the circumstances. Italian pilots flying the C.202 scored hundreds of confirmed victories, and several aces, such as Franco Lucchini and Adriano Visconti, achieved significant success against Allied fighters. The aircraft's ability to compete with and sometimes outperform the best Allied fighters gave the Regia Aeronautica renewed prestige, even as the broader war situation deteriorated. By mid-1943, however, the pace of Allied technological development was beginning to overtake the Folgore. The arrival of newer Spitfire variants, Mustangs, and Thunderbolts reduced its relative effectiveness, and Italy's collapsing industrial base made it impossible to produce enough aircraft to replace losses. Still, the C.202 remained in frontline service until the armistice in September 1943, continuing to fight in defense of Italian skies. In summary, the Folgore's combat use demonstrated both the potential and the limits of Italian aviation. It was a fighter that could hold its own against the Allies' best during 1941-42, but by 1943 it was increasingly outclassed by newer designs. Its operational record stands as a testament to Italian engineering and pilot skill, showing that, given the right machine, Italian aviators were fully capable of matching their adversaries in one of the most demanding arenas of the war. The Macchi C.202 underwent a steady process of refinement during its production run, resulting in a number of important variants that extended its service life and sought to address its shortcomings. While the core airframe remained largely unchanged from Castoldi's original design, modifications focused on armament, specialized mission roles, and incremental performance improvements. Each version reflected the Regia Aeronautica's attempts to adapt the Folgore to the rapidly evolving air war of the early 1940s. The most significant criticism of the C.202 was its light armament. The standard configuration of two 12.7-meter Breda Safat machine guns mounted in the nose, sometimes supplemented by two 7.7-meter wing guns, was adequate against early war opponents but increasingly ineffective against later Allied fighters and especially heavy bombers. To address this, later production batches of the C.202 introduced wing-mounted 12.7-millimeter machine guns, bringing total armament to 4 heavy guns. While this improved firepower, it came at the cost of additional weight and a slight reduction in agility, qualities that had originally distinguished the Folgore. Several reconnaissance variants were also produced. The C.202 RF was equipped with cameras in place of some armament and used for tactical photo reconnaissance missions. Its high speed and maneuverability made it well suited to this role, allowing Italian commanders to obtain intelligence over contested areas where slower aircraft would not have survived. Training variants included the C.202D and C.202DC, which were dual-control versions used to familiarize new pilots with the Folgore's handling. Given the high-performance nature of the aircraft, these trainer variants played an important role in ensuring smooth transitions for young pilots who were accustomed to flying older Saettas or biplanes. The Folgore also served as the basis for experimental adaptations. One such project involved testing different armament arrangements, including attempts to fit 20mm Mauser MG 151 cannons under the wings. These efforts aimed to improve the fighter's lethality against bombers, but often proved impractical due to weight and balance issues. Another proposal envisioned adapting the Folgore as a fighter-bomber, capable of carrying light bombs under the fuselage or wings. While some limited ground attack operations were carried out with bomb racks fitted, the aircraft was never formally standardized in this role, as the Regia Aeronautica lacked the resources to pursue such developments fully. Perhaps the most important evolutionary step was the transition from the C.202 to its successor, the Macchi C.205 Veltro. The C.205 retained much of the Folgore's airframe but replaced the DB601 engine with the more powerful Daimler-Benz DB605, license-built in Italy, as the Fiat RA.1050 Tifone. This upgrade gave the Veltro significantly improved performance and allowed it to compete with the latest Allied fighters of 1943-44. In this sense, the C.202 served as the foundation for Italy's final and most advanced wartime fighter designs. In total, approximately 150 Macchi C.202s were built between mid-1941 and late 1943, with production spread across Macchi, Breda, and SAI Ambrosini facilities. While this number was respectable, it was insufficient to equip the entire Regia Aeronautica, forcing many squadrons to operate mixed fleets of Folgores, Saettas, and German aircraft. Shortages of engines and raw materials further limited the rate of production, ensuring that the Folgore never achieved the numerical presence that might have altered Italy's air war more significantly. Internationally, the C.202 also saw limited use by Italy's Axis partners. A small number were supplied to Croatia, where they were used against partisan forces and Allied aircraft in the Balkans. The aircraft's reputation, however, spread beyond its production figures. German Luftwaffe pilots who flew the Folgore praised its handling and agility, while Allied intelligence assessments acknowledged it as Italy's best and most dangerous fighter. The Folgore's incremental improvements and variants highlight both the ingenuity of Italian designers and the severe industrial constraints under which they labored. Though never produced in sufficient numbers or with the heavy armament of its contemporaries, the C.202 represented a leap forward from earlier Italian fighters and laid the groundwork for the C.205 and other advanced designs. In this way, the Folgore's evolutionary path bridged the gap between Italy's outdated pre-war aircraft and its final generation of competitive wartime fighters. The global impact and legacy of the Macchi C.202 Folgore are best appreciated when placed against the wider context of the Second World War and its aftermath. Although it was produced in modest numbers and entered service relatively late, the Folgore represented a fundamental shift in Italian fighter aviation and marked the moment when the Regia Aeronautica could finally field an aircraft on par with the best fighters of its time. In operational terms, the C.202 significantly improved Italy's effectiveness in the Mediterranean and North African theaters. For much of 1940 and 1941, Italian pilots had struggled in outdated machines, often facing Spitfires, Hurricanes, and later American P-40s at a disadvantage. The introduction of the Folgore restored balance and allowed Italian squadrons to fight with renewed confidence. Even Allied reports acknowledged the C.202's speed, maneuverability, and overall handling as first-rate. RAF and USAAF pilots who faced it noted that in skilled hands, the Folgore was a dangerous opponent and could not be dismissed lightly. Its influence extended beyond morale. The C.202 demonstrated that Italy was capable of absorbing foreign technology, in this case the German DB601 engine, and integrating it successfully into an indigenous airframe. The resulting fighter became the basis for Italy's next generation of aircraft, most notably the Macchi C.205 Veltro and the Fiat G55 Centauro. These successors, directly descended from the Folgore, represented Italy's finest wartime designs and were capable of matching late-war Allied fighters. Without the C.202 as a transitional platform, such progress would have been impossible. Internationally, the Folgore's legacy was smaller but still notable. As mentioned, limited numbers were supplied to the Croatian Air Force, where they saw combat in the Balkans. After the 1943 armistice, some Folgores were taken over by the Italian Social Republic's Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana, fighting alongside the Luftwaffe against Allied forces in northern Italy. Others were flown by the co-belligerent Italian forces on the Allied side, continuing service until newer aircraft could be supplied. This dual use underlined the type's adaptability and reliability even in Italy's fractured wartime environment. From a design perspective, the Folgore left a lasting impression on aviation historians and engineers alike. It embodied the principle that a well-balanced airframe, when combined with a modern inline engine, could transform performance dramatically. While the C.202 itself was not revolutionary in armament or range, its aerodynamic efficiency and excellent handling made it one of the finest fighters of its generation. Post-war analyses by Allied technical teams praised its design sophistication, with some pilots comparing its handling favorably to the Bf-109 and even certain Spitfire variants. The Folgore's cultural and symbolic legacy within Italy was equally significant. For Italian pilots, it represented a moment of redemption, a chance to fight with a machine that did justice to their skill and courage. It became the symbol of Italy's best efforts in the air war, often remembered as the finest fighter the Regia Aeronautica ever fielded during the conflict. This reputation endured long after the war, with surviving veterans consistently ranking it above other Italian wartime types. Today, the Macchi C.202 is preserved in only a handful of surviving examples, displayed in museums such as the Italian Air Force Museum at Vigna di Valle. These rare airframes serve as reminders not only of Italy's technological achievements, but also of the broader struggle of its aviation industry to keep pace in a rapidly advancing global conflict. The Folgore's legacy lives on as a symbol of Italian engineering ingenuity, a fighter that overcame the limitations of its predecessors and earned respect on both sides of the war. Ultimately, the Macchi C.202 did not alter the outcome of the Second World War. Italy's industrial base, limited resources, and strategic disadvantages ensured that even its best fighter could not turn the tide. Yet within its historical context, the Folgore holds an enduring place as a technological milestone. Italy's finest fighter of the war, a machine that restored balance to its air force, and a design that pointed the way to the advanced aircraft that would follow. Lesser-known chapters of the Macchi C.202 Folgore's story reveal both its adaptability and the experimental spirit of Italian designers, who sought to expand the aircraft's usefulness beyond its primary role as a frontline fighter. These efforts, though often overshadowed by its combat record, illustrate the broader attempts of the Regia Aeronautica to innovate under severe wartime pressures. One of the most intriguing aspects was the Folgore's use in research and testing programs. Several airframes were employed as prototypes to trial heavier armament, including the installation of German 20mm Mauser MG 150-20 cannons in underwing gondolas. While this gave the aircraft the firepower it sorely lacked against bombers, the added weight and drag reduced its agility, one of the Folgore's greatest strengths. As a result, this variant was not widely adopted, but the lessons learned fed directly into the development of the Macchi C.205, which carried heavier armament as standard. Another experimental path explored the Folgore as a fighter bomber. Modifications were tested to allow the C.202 to carry small bombs under the wings or fuselage, turning it into a light attack aircraft for use against ground targets. Although only limited numbers were adapted in this way, they did see service in North Africa, where Axis forces often lacked sufficient dedicated ground attack aircraft. In practice, the aircraft's light bomb load and vulnerability during low-altitude attacks limited its effectiveness in this role, but it demonstrated the flexibility of the design. Some Folgores were also used as test platforms for new engines and aerodynamic refinements. Italian engineers experimented with cooling systems and intake designs, looking for ways to improve efficiency and reliability. A few C.202s were employed as transitional trainers for pilots preparing to fly the more advanced C.205 Veltro, essentially serving as stepping stones into Italy's final generation of wartime fighters. There were also unusual operational chapters. After the armistice of September 1943, surviving Folgores were split between the two Italias. Some served with the Aeronautica Cobelligerante del Sud under Allied control, while others flew for the Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana in the north, fighting alongside the Luftwaffe. This unusual duality meant that Italian pilots could, in theory, find themselves facing the same aircraft on opposite sides of the front, a rare occurrence in the air war. The Germans also took interest in the Folgore. A handful were evaluated by the Luftwaffe, with pilots praising its handling qualities and comparing it favorably to the Messerschmitt Bf 109F. However, with German production already concentrated on its own designs, no large-scale adoption was considered. Still, the positive impressions of German pilots underscored the respect the Folgore had earned beyond Italy. Finally, some Folgores were captured and examined by the Allies. The RAF tested at least one example, with pilots noting its balance and maneuverability, though again commenting on its weak armament. These evaluations provided valuable insight into Axis aviation and confirmed the Folgore as a first-class fighter handicapped, mainly by Italy's limited industrial output and shortage of modern weaponry. In sum, the less visible chapters of the Folgore's history highlight its adaptability and its role as more than just a frontline interceptor. It was used as a testbed for heavier weapons, as a light fighter bomber, as a transitional trainer, and even as a tool for intelligence gathering by both Axis and Allied forces. Though many of these roles were secondary and improvised, they reflect the aircraft's versatility and the high regard in which it was held. The Folgore's story, therefore, extends beyond the battlefield, encompassing experimentation, dual service after Italy's split, and post-war analysis, elements that enrich its reputation as Italy's best fighter of the war. By the end of the war, the Macchi C.202 Folgore had already been overshadowed by its direct successor, the more powerful C.205 Veltro. Yet its influence carried into the post-war years and into the collective memory of Italian aviation. Its legacy was defined less by numbers, since only about 1,250 were built, than by the way it demonstrated that Italy, when given access to modern engines and streamlined production, could produce a fighter capable of competing with the world's best. After Italy's surrender in September 1943, surviving Folgores were divided between the two Italies. In the south, under the Aeronautica Cobelligerante Italiana, some C-202s continued to serve briefly alongside the Allies, though increasingly replaced by British and American aircraft supplied under Lend-Lease. In the north, the Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana, aligned with Germany, kept its Folgores flying until the final collapse in 1945. A few were also absorbed into Luftwaffe units for evaluation or local defense, though never in significant numbers. This dual service symbolized the fractured nature of Italy's wartime experience, with the same aircraft fighting on both sides of the conflict. Internationally, the C-202 saw only limited export. Small numbers were delivered to the independent state of Croatia, where they were used against partisans and Allied aircraft in the Balkans. Other Axis partners showed interest, but Germany preferred to reserve engine production for its own fighters, and Italian industry could not spare the capacity to build large numbers for export. As a result, the Folgore's foreign presence remained minimal, its impact felt primarily within Italian operations. In terms of influence on future designs, the C-202 proved crucial. It provided the structural and aerodynamic foundation for the C-205 Veltro, which, with its Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, finally gave Italy a fighter capable of matching the Spitfire 9, P-51 Mustang, and Bf-109G on nearly equal terms. The Folgore's design also influenced the Fiat G55 Centauro and Reggiane Re 2005 Sagittario, together known as the Serie 5 fighters, which represented Italy's last generation of high-performance wartime aircraft. Thus, the Folgore served as the bridge between Italy's underpowered pre-war monoplanes and its genuinely competitive late-war designs. In cultural terms, the Folgore became the symbol of Italy's best effort in the air war. Italian aces who flew it, such as Franco Lucchini and Adriano Visconti, remembered it as the machine that finally allowed them to meet their opponents on even terms. Allied pilots, too, came to respect it as a worthy adversary, often comparing it favorably to their own fighters in terms of handling. Its reputation endured long after the war, with aviation historians consistently ranking it as one of the finest Axis fighters of the early 1940s. Today, the Folgore is preserved in only a few surviving examples. Restored aircraft can be seen at the Italian Air Force Museum at Vigna di Valle, near Rome, and fragments exist in other collections. These rare survivors stand as reminders of Italy's peak in wartime aviation design, embodying both the technical achievements and the industrial limitations of the nation during the conflict. In retrospect, the Macchi C.202 Folgore's importance lies not in decisive victories or large-scale production, but in its role as a turning point. It marked the moment when Italian aviation finally produced a fighter equal to those of its adversaries. While it arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome of the war, it left behind a legacy of engineering excellence, operational respect, and symbolic pride. The Folgore remains remembered as Italy's best fighter of the Second World War, a machine that embodied the skill of its designers, the bravery of its pilots, and the tragic limitations of the nation that built it. The final chapter of the Macchi C.202 Folgore's history is one of transition, legacy, and symbolism. By 1944, the type was no longer Italy's cutting edge, having given way to the more powerful C.205 Veltro and other Serie 5 fighters. Yet the Folgore remained in service until the last days of the war, and even beyond, cementing its reputation as Italy's most important fighter of the conflict. After the armistice in September 1943, Folgores continued to serve in divided loyalties. In the south, where the Aeronautica Cobelligerante Italiana fought alongside the Allies, the Folgore was retained in diminishing numbers as a stopgap before Allied aircraft took over. In the north, the Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana used Folgores in defense of northern Italian cities and industrial sites under constant Allied bombing. Here, the limitations of the aircraft, particularly its inadequate armament against heavy bombers, were starkly exposed. Even so, pilots continued to fly them with determination, often in desperate missions against overwhelming odds. A small number of Folgores survived the war and entered service in the newly reconstituted post-war Italian Air Force, the Aeronautica Militare Italiana. They were used mainly as trainers and transitional aircraft until newer foreign fighters such as the Spitfire and Mustang arrived in quantity. In this post-war role, the Folgore became both a practical tool for rebuilding Italy's air arm and a symbolic reminder of the nation's technological achievements during a turbulent era. The aircraft's post-war influence was felt less in direct operational use than in the design lineage it established. The Folgore had provided the aerodynamic and structural foundation for the C.205 Veltro, Fiat G55 Centauro, and Reggiane Re 2005 Sagittario, Italy's most advanced wartime fighters. These designs, though produced in small numbers, demonstrated that Italian engineering could produce aircraft competitive with the best Allied machines. In many ways, the Folgore's true legacy was as a bridge between Italy's outdated pre-war monoplanes and its last generation of high-performance wartime fighters. Internationally, the Folgore left only faint traces. Unlike German or Allied fighters, it was not exported widely, and only a few examples reached Croatia or were evaluated by Germany and the Allies. Yet its reputation grew after the war through the assessments of pilots and historians. Allied intelligence had recognized during the conflict that the Folgore was a first-class opponent, and post-war analyses confirmed that it was one of the finest Axis fighters of its era, surpassed only by late-war designs that had the benefit of more powerful engines and heavier armament. In Italian memory, the Folgore became a symbol of pride. Veterans consistently described it as the best aircraft they flew during the war, praising its handling, speed, and reliability. While it could not match the firepower or durability of later Allied fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt or P-51 Mustang, it gave Italian pilots a machine worthy of their skill at a time when many of their country's weapons were outdated. It is remembered not as a miracle weapon, but as a balanced, practical, and elegant design that showed what Italian aviation was capable of under immense constraints. Today, surviving Folgores in museums stand as rare reminders of this legacy. They represent both the high point of Italian wartime aircraft engineering and the broader tragedy of a nation unable to produce its best designs in sufficient numbers to effect the war. For historians and enthusiasts, the Macchi C.202 remains a symbol of what Italian aviation achieved in spite of resource shortages and industrial weakness. In the end, the Folgore story is less about decisive victories and more about what it represented, a glimpse of what Italy could accomplish when design brilliance met modern technology. Though overshadowed by later fighters, the C.202 was the machine that restored Italian pride in the air and proved that, given the right tools, its pilots could match any opponent. Its name, Folgore Thunderbolt, remains an apt description of a fighter that struck quickly, shone brightly, and left an enduring mark on the history of the Second World War. By the time the Macchi C.202 Folgore disappeared from frontline service, its role in the history of the Second World War was already firmly established. It had not been produced in sufficient numbers to alter Italy's strategic fortunes, nor could it overcome the overwhelming industrial and numerical superiority of the Allies. Yet its significance lies in its quality. It was the first Italian fighter of the war that could truly stand alongside its contemporaries, restoring dignity and capability to the Regia Aeronautica during some of its most challenging campaigns. The Folgore represented the turning point for Italian aviation design. Where earlier fighters like the C.200 Saietta or Fiat G50 had been hopelessly outclassed, the C.202 proved that Italian engineers could match the standards of the day when given access to modern engines and materials. Its combination of aerodynamic refinement, excellent handling, and competitive speed made it respected by friend and foe alike. Allied pilots who faced it over North Africa and the Mediterranean often reported that it was a machine to be taken seriously, while Italian pilots consistently praised its balance and reliability. Its legacy extended beyond combat statistics. The Folgore laid the foundation for Italy's Serie 5 fighters, aircraft like the C.205 Veltro, Fiat G55 Centauro, and Reggiane Re 2005, that represented the peak of Italian wartime design. Without the Folgore as the bridge, these later more powerful machines could not have been developed so quickly or effectively. In this sense, the C.202's influence went far beyond its own service life, shaping the final generation of Axis fighters and ensuring Italy contributed meaningfully to the late-war technological race. Post-war, the Folgore's reputation endured even as its airframes disappeared from active service. For the reformed Aeronautica Militare Italiana, it was remembered as a symbol of skill and resilience, an aircraft that gave Italian pilots the chance to demonstrate their abilities on equal terms with Allied airmen. Its image featured in post-war publications, memoirs, and historical studies often contrasted with the industrial limitations that prevented Italy from producing it in the numbers required. Today, only a handful of preserved examples and fragments remain in museums, but the Folgore retains a special place in aviation history. It is studied not only as a technical achievement, but also as a reminder of how innovation can emerge under pressure, even within nations facing overwhelming disadvantages. To aviation historians, it remains one of the finest fighters of its generation, a machine elegant in design, balanced in performance, and representative of Italian ingenuity. In the broader sweep of the war, the Macchi C.202 Folgore could not change Italy's fate, but it provided a glimpse of what might have been possible had the nation's industry matched its designer's talent. Its name, meaning thunderbolt, captures its essence perfectly: swift, precise, and fleeting. Though overshadowed by later aircraft, the Folgore endures as Italy's best fighter of the Second World War, a testament to the brilliance of Mario Castoldi's design and the courage of the pilots who flew it in some of the hardest-fought skies of the Mediterranean.